To those who can hear it, the sound means death. America is on the brink of annihilation. An invading army is at the doorstep of one of the country's largest cities. Its capital has been ravaged, its defenses shattered. Only one thing stands between the enemy force and the nation's destruction: the will of 15,000 men and women determined to defeat America's first invasion. The War of 1812 was a strange and at times an illogical affair. Its reasoning was muddled, its execution mismanaged. It was named for 1 year, but took nearly 3 to fight. Its main cause was no longer a factor before the first shot was fired, and its most famous battle was fought after the peace treaty was signed. Despite these dubious distinctions, the war played a crucial role in establishing America's direction and identity. This second war for independence inspired the national anthem and allowed founding fathers to make way for a new generation of common men with uncommon courage who would lead the nation to its manifest destiny.
War of 1812 is important because it gave the United States a new standing in the world. It was 30 years after the American Revolution, and now the Americans had a chance to make a statement to the world and to show that they were truly independent.
The War of 1812 is a defining moment for this country. It's the first war, the real big war since the Revolutionary War. Is the country going to survive the test of endurance, resilience, determination, unity?
It is the story of a childish nation, which, but for the grace of God and a few soldiers, sailors, Marines, almost never has the chance to reach maturity.
The War of 1812 is a story as much about a nation in conflict with itself as it is a clash of countries. Early 19th century America is a loose association of scattered states, bordered by a vast wilderness to the west and miles of ocean to its east. Isolated communities are surrounded by uncharted and hostile territory. Americans are intertwined by one thread: shipping.
We think of farmers and pioneers as only growing things for their own consumption, but Americans were deeply involved in commerce, even as farmers. One of the largest employers in this time was the maritime trades, shipbuilding, serving as sailors. This was a huge building block of our economy.
But for most of the decade, that way of life has been on the brink of extinction. Great Britain has continually violated America's shipping rights on the high seas. At the top of a growing list of grievances, impressment of Americans by the British Navy.
The British at this time are fighting an important war against Napoleonic France, and in order to fight this war, they need manpower for the Royal Navy. So they're stopping American ships on the high seas and forcing Americans to serve in the Navy.
There were thousands of British sailors had deserted to the American Merchant Marine for better pay and conditions, and many of them take out citizenship. Britain does not recognize the right of any of its citizens to renounce nationality, and so they reply with the blunt instrument of their fearsome 1,000-ship navy.
In 1807, then-President Thomas Jefferson had urged Congress to pass the Embargo Act, a law forbidding foreign commerce. But it backfired, hurting U.S. ports more than it did British trade. The act was repealed, and the impressments continued.
In a 6-year period leading up to 1810, they forcibly haul off about 5,000 sailors from American ships. About 1,300 of these are later found to have been born in America. So you can imagine what this did to the national feeling.
But impressment reflects a more extensive and dangerous tension between the two countries, something that never really ended after the Revolutionary War.
Some of the merchants in the Northeast looked to the British as their great friends in commerce, but other Americans are very aware of a sense of animosity that lasts for decades between the two countries. And we know that the British are very eager to maintain some control in the Mississippi Valley. They are inciting the Indians, they're aiding them, and American settlers feel the British are the reason that they're being attacked by the Indians.
The rising tide of resentment was about to become a maelstrom, and at its center was a man who realizes that war is quickly becoming all but inevitable. At just 5 feet 4 inches tall and only 100 pounds, a pygmy as one political foe described him, President James Madison is a slight man, but he is also the towering intellect among the founding fathers and the architect of the Constitution.
Madison is a complex guy. He is not very impressive physically, short, he's known as Little Jemmy, but he's got a giant of a brain. This is really one of the most brilliant men on the stage in America at the time. But if you met him, you would think, kind of a cold fish. And I think maybe today we'd call him kind of nerdy, but he turns out to be a pretty capable president.
But on June 1st, 1812, Madison will put that sacred document through a new and dangerous trial. This unlikely commander-in-chief will become the first president to ask Congress to declare war. In his message to Congress, President Madison lists the grievances justifying his call for war against Great Britain. They include interfering with trade on the high seas and inciting Indian attacks on the frontier. But the issue that stirs the most outrage tops Madison's list.
British ships have continually violated the American flag on the Great Highway of Nations and have seized and carried off persons sailing under its protection. They spill American blood within the waters under our territorial control.
But not everyone joins the battle cry of the war hawks. What had started as a clear injustice becomes bogged down in economic and political interests. Madison's conviction reveals a deep schism in a young America. Regions with conflicting interests are about to line up on both sides of the issue, with Madison caught in the crosshairs.
Madison thought that the main political problem was the opposition to the war in New England. New England opposed the war as they had opposed all of the commercial restrictions that had gone on for 5 or 10 years because they were especially harmful to it economically.
Congressmen from New England and members of the opposition Federalist Party argue that this war would threaten their seaport-based livelihood. They accuse the president of embroiling the U.S. in a pointless and costly conflict. Despite the chaos that grips Washington, on June 18, 1812, Congress acts on the president's request. Every Federalist casts a nay vote, but Mr. Madison gets his war. For many, it still remains an unpopular cause. Days later, demonstrators clash in the streets of Baltimore. Dozens are killed or injured. But for Madison, there is no turning back. He realizes the issue of impressment is just the beginning of what could be a reconquest of the young nation. The decision to go to war is a battle for the soul of America itself.
Madison felt, many did, that if we lost, we would lose independence. And the peace terms that Britain later proposed for the war when they thought they were winning indicated that they would reclaim American territory.
Ironically, the conflict might have been avoided altogether if communication had been quicker. 2 days before Congress votes to go to war, Great Britain revokes the law authorizing impressment, thus eliminating America's main grievance. But by the time the news reaches Washington several weeks later, it is too late. The United States has entered its First World War. Despite their militant fervor, the war hawks and other pro-war Republicans ignore one glaring fact. The United States is completely unprepared to wage war. We have long been habituated to despise the Americans, sneers a British officer, as an enemy unworthy of serious regard.
At the beginning of the War of 1812, the American military is practically impotent. It is a collection of small companies scattered around the United States. It is a constabulary force designed to police and enforce America's laws, but it's really a token force. Actually, they're more of a danger to themselves than to the enemy, from inept leadership.
The officers who had served in the Revolution have now died away or retired. So this is a whole new generation of leadership, none of which has seen substantial combat, all of whom underestimate the substantial challenges they'll have to face.
On the other hand, the British Army is at the height of its professional competence. Their troops are well trained, they're well equipped. Their officer corps, unlike the American officer corps at the beginning of the War of 1812, is young. Quite young, yet very experienced.
What makes the British Army the best is determination, refusal to accept defeat. In the face of everything that might sensibly say, you are gone, the British will stick at it and will continue until they succeed.
And yet another glaring drawback faces the United States. It has no real navy to speak of.
The British Navy is a huge problem. The Americans are never going to be able to create anything to compete with the size of the British Navy. So what do? We do have sailors. We do have merchants. We do have entrepreneurial, successful business people. So the Congress encourages privateers, people to go out privately and raid British shipping, hoping to kind of level the field.
On the international scene, the American people of 1812 are viewed as unsophisticated, disorganized, and unrealistic. And that is just how they will fight this war. The disparity between British and American forces becomes immediately apparent in the days following the outbreak of the conflict. Just weeks after war is declared, military commanders target Britain's last stronghold in North America, Canada.
The war hawks in Congress were already getting aggressively interested in Canada. They thought this is their way to get back at England for what they saw of insults to the American flag, impressment of seamen. They thought Canada would be easy pickings.
What are they thinking? We've got 7.5 million people in the United States, and that's still not enough to settle all the land we have. Why are they casting an eye on Canada? We don't even have militiamen who are willing to cross that border.
What many had once predicted would be a matter of mere marching turns into one of the biggest blunders in American military history.
America is ill-prepared to defend its western borders, and the opening years of the war are just a series of unmitigated disasters for the young nation. Mackinac Falls, Dearborn Falls, Detroit Falls with virtually no resistance by the Americans. America simply cannot stand up to the military force of Great Britain during this time.
Of all the forts to fall, Detroit is the most disastrous. 2,000 men surrender without firing a single musket. It is an ominous beginning to what would become a confusing and drawn-out engagement. The one bright spot in these early days comes from one of the few ships of the non-existent U.S. Navy. Just 3 days after American forces surrender Detroit, the USS Constitution finds the HMS Guerriere off the New England coast. For the crew of the Constitution, the battle is intensely personal. The Guerriere is one of the most famous of the ships noted for impressment. Over the next 3 hours, the two slug it out. When solid shot fired from Guerriere's guns fails to penetrate the Constitution's solid oak timbers, the American vessel earns its immortal nickname, Old Ironsides. The Constitution returns to Massachusetts a hero, and a conflict that began in a political haze has its first real victory. It would be short-lived. As the War of 1812 drags into 1813, the campaign to conquer Canada has mostly misfired. But that April, the Americans enflame the British and set the stage for the most dramatic act of revenge in the war. On April 27th, American troops attack York, the capital of Upper Canada, and set fire to the Parliament building. The British will not forget this act of devastation. Just 1 year later, they will launch the first invasion of the United States and bring the war right to President Madison's doorstep. From its outset, the War of 1812 has been of secondary concern to the British. For the previous 9 years, they've been preoccupied in an epic war against the greatest military genius of the age, Napoleon.
With the war going on against Napoleon in Europe, the British are very tight on what soldiers can be sent over to the Americas. They have a few regiments in the country, the one stationed in Canada, of course. So the main thing is a holding action. Once America has been stopped from the invasion of Canada, there's very little that Britain can do until Napoleon is out of the way.
In early 1814, the British finally defeat the French emperor. That July, thousands of battle-tested redcoats set sail for the Chesapeake Bay to launch the first invasion of the United States. American troops, who have been fighting in mostly poorly trained and poorly equipped militias for almost 2 years, are about to face a force unlike any they have ever seen. The British have every reason to expect victory. For the past year, the British fleet in North America has been tightening its blockade of the Atlantic coast. Leading the offensive is a man for whom America's destruction is a personal vendetta, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane.
Sir Alexander Cochrane has a very strong distaste for anything American. This is actually brought about because he had a cousin killed in the American Revolution. He himself was in the Navy at that time and fought against the Americans, and this has conditioned him to have what would really be seen as almost an obsession about the Americans.
In 1814, from the deck of his flagship, Cochrane had issued orders that reflected the pending British onslaught and his personal obsession.
Destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. I want to give the enemy a complete drubbing before it's all over.
Vice Admiral George Cockburn carried out Cochrane's orders with merciless efficiency.
There's an interesting quote from Admiral Cockburn where he suggested that Americans should be treated like a naughty spaniel. That is to say, if it snaps at you, you hit it on the nose. And this is exactly what he was doing.
In the spring and summer of 1813, Cockburn launches raids at will along the Chesapeake, plundering villages before burning them to the ground. It is just a sampling of things to come.
The British are wreaking havoc on the American countryside. There's virtually no opposition. The American military presence is not in the Chesapeake in the way it should be. All important regular assets are up along the Canadian border. So it's up to the Maryland, Virginia militia to defend an extensive border. They can't keep up.
Some of these soldiers are just thugs. They are burning homes. They are raping women. The countryside is devastated. The people are horrified. It's almost like a game to Admiral Cockburn. Let's see what we can get away with here.
The fear of more British raids and news of thousands of redcoats on the way soon reaches the capital. This new attack is a complete surprise for Madison. His administration is in turmoil, and he hesitates to act, mainly because of one man.
The capital remained undefended, and the principal reason was the Secretary of War, John Armstrong. He was one of those characters history throws up time and time again, men who believe that their judgment is best for everybody else, even when reality to the contrary stares them in the face.
By God, they would not come with such a fleet without meaning to strike somewhere. But they certainly will not come here. What the devil will they do here?
Armstrong insists the British will strike Baltimore, a major commercial center, not the capital. But President Madison responds to the growing panic gripping Washington and overrides Armstrong. He creates the 10th Military District, an area encompassing Washington, and selects a political appointee, William Winder, to lead this new defense.
Winder has very little real power. He's inexperienced, and it doesn't help to have a Secretary of War who's not willing to cooperate. As a result, Winder has probably 500 regular troops at his disposal and no militia, because the Secretary of War will not let him call out the militia from Maryland and Virginia unless of dire immediate emergency.
That emergency becomes a reality on August 19th, when 5,000 British troops land at Benedict, Maryland, less than 25 miles from Washington.
path to the capital is clear. The capital itself is like tethered prey. And as the British began their march west, fear is overtaken by terror in Washington, and terror becomes pandemonium, because this is a defenseless city.
In the chaos consuming the capital, President Madison issues 2 orders: concentrate troops as quickly as possible and remove all government papers from the city for safekeeping. That task falls to clerk Steve Pleasanton.
He hurries to buy coarse, durable linen, which he orders cut and sewn into book bags. And into these, he and others gently put, believe it or not, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, international treaties, and George Washington's correspondence. While this is being done, the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, passed by and rebukes Pleasanton for being an alarmist, for thinking the British were on their way to Washington. Pleasanton, unintimidated, says that it's more prudent to try and protect the documents of the revolutionary government.
Armstrong seems to be the only person not fleeing or trying to defend Washington. At the seat of power, cabinet members leave the capital and head into the city. Secretary of State James Monroe volunteers as a scout. Even President Madison rides into the countryside to rally the troops. General Winder rushes everywhere, desperately trying to determine where the British will strike. With each new report, he exhausts his men with countermarches.
General Winder decides to make a stand to defend Washington 10 miles from the White House. And here, on the eastern branch of the Potomac, is where the fate of Washington is going to be decided.
Winder makes his stand at Bladensburg, Maryland, just 6 miles from Washington, in what will be one of the most notorious American military embarrassments of the entire war. There, on August 24th, his hastily gathered, inexperienced defenders face off against veteran troops under Major General Robert Ross, the commander of the land-based invasion force.
Ross, in many ways, is the ideal combat commander. He's aggressive, he's brave, and he leads at the head of his troops. He doesn't expect anyone to do something he's not willing to take on himself.
On Ross's order, British troops advanced toward the first of 3 American lines. They quickly outflanked the defenders and forced them to retreat. As the British move toward the second line, American artillery blasts the oncoming light brigade. Despite this deadly onslaught, the second line begins to break.
Most of the British soldiers under Ross are veterans of the Peninsula War. They've been up against some of the best troops in the world, the French. And they're just amazed, however, at how slight the resistance is from the Americans. They expected more from Yankee Doodle.
The third line makes a desperate last stand until the British finally overrun them. General Winder orders a retreat that turns into a panic-stricken race back to Washington. They run so fast that the Redcoats suffer heat stroke trying to keep up with them. Charles Ball, a free black and one of the defenders on that third line, recalls the last moments of what will go down in history as the Bladensburg races.
If the militia regiments could have been brought to charge the British, we should have killed or taken the whole of them in a short time. But the militia ran like sheep chased by dogs.
In just 1 hour, all resistance has been wiped off the map. Now nothing stands in the way of the British as they advance toward Washington, less than 1 day's march away. Madison realizes that the onslaught is inevitable and seeks to remove himself from harm's way.
Maybe it's something like George Bush on 9/11. He's trying to find a place where he can get a hold of the situation, find out what's happening, make sure that there's not going to be more trouble in Washington, and if there is, he wants to be somewhere else.
In the aftermath of the battle, the once flourishing capital is becoming a ghost town as government officials flee the city. Battered American troops staggering back into Washington have no information of the president's whereabouts. Within hours, the British invasion force will enter Washington. As the capital descends into chaos and with the president and members of his cabinet unaccounted for, one woman will spearhead the last defense of the seat of power before the Redcoats put it to the torch. August 24th, 1814, would go down as one of the blackest days in American history. It began with a humiliating defeat at Bladensburg, Maryland, and ended with the destruction of the nation's capital. The events of this one day would test the mettle of a young nation and provide some of the most memorable moments in America's so-called forgotten war. While the British overrun American forces and advance on Washington, just 6 miles away, one woman remains firmly entrenched in the White House, the First Lady, Dolly Madison.
Dolly Madison is my favorite character in American history. And the reason is this woman is not only courageous and heroic, risking her life to save things for posterity. This is a woman who is beloved. The most beloved woman ever to occupy the White House, admired and respected by the rich, absolutely beloved by the poor.
Dolly and James Madison make up one of the oddest couples in Washington. While the president was bookish and introverted, she was the life of the party. She loved to dip snuff, play cards, and scoop ice cream, all while modeling the latest fashions.
But don't think of her as someone who is superficial. People think of her as someone that they respect. They understand that she has the ability to bring out the best in her husband. She makes the president more approachable. She helps bring factions together within the Republican Party. She's a very astute and very charming First Lady.
But within hours, the British would be at the doorstep of the house she had transformed into the center of Washington society. She receives word from her husband, who's out rallying troops. Evacuate the White House. As the desperate minutes dwindle, Dolly Madison heads for a national treasure.
This is a woman who, at the risk of her life, while the British are advancing on Washington, and the male guards have fled from around the White House, this lady decides to save George Washington's portrait, painted by Gilbert Stuart, for the single reason that it has to be protected and saved for future generations. Which one of us, male or female today, would risk our lives for a painting? And she did that.
I insist on waiting till the large picture of General Washington is taken, so I have ordered the frame to be broken and the painting taken out. It is done.
The First Lady is among the last to evacuate the city. She finally boards her carriage, searching for her husband. By 8 p.m., British forces, led by Major General Ross, enter Washington.
It was never expected that an army of 4,000 men could march with little or no difficulty, take and have at its mercy the capital of the United States.
In retaliation for burning the Canadian Parliament at York the previous April, British troops prepare to set fire to Washington's government buildings. Redcoats, under the command of Vice Admiral Coburn, break into the Capitol. They stage a mock legislation and vote unanimously to burn the building. One resident watches the fire from her rooftop.
No drawing room was ever as brilliantly lit as the whole city that night. As flames burst through the roof of the Capitol, there was a roll of thunder.
At about 10:30 p.m., the men move on to another key government target, the White House. In the dining room, they find the table set. Coburn orders wine poured, and in a sarcastic toast to the president, drinks to Jemmy's health. Soldiers rampage through the rooms, grabbing souvenirs, including a ceremonial sword and a pair of rhinestone buckles. Even Major General Ross pockets President Madison's love letters to Dolly. Outside the mansion, the Redcoats pitch their torches through the windows, engulfing the White House in flames.
The destruction of Washington's public buildings, these fires, the glow of which was seen 50 miles away, struck at the hearts of many Americans wherever they were.
Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe, recalls George Douglas, a militia private. Perhaps no one feels the emotions more deeply than President Madison, who watches the fires from horseback in Virginia.
There's no sign of panic. There was intense concern about making sure the government didn't fold up, and he felt, of course, a responsibility. At that stage, Madison was thinking, where would he find Dolly? Where would the rest of the government be? How could he reconvene them to show that the government could still function and still exist in an effective form?
The next morning, August 25th, the British set the Library of Congress and the Navy Yard afire as storm clouds threaten overhead. But at 2 o'clock that afternoon, two events would transform a burning Washington into a scene beyond comprehension. With little warning, one of the most powerful hurricanes in its history hits Washington. Lightning splits clouds open as gale-force winds tear through the city.
Out of nowhere comes this uncanny storm, which not only dumps a tremendous torrential downpour, but it rages against this British column.
One redcoat recalls the fury of this perfect storm.
Our column was completely dispersed, as if it had received a total defeat. Some of the men flying for shelter behind walls and buildings, and others falling flat upon the ground to prevent themselves from being carried away. Such was the violence of the wind that two pieces of cannon were fairly lifted from the ground and borne several yards away.
What has started out as a blessing is about to become a catastrophic event of epic proportions. As the hurricane wreaks destruction throughout the burning city, a tornado suddenly appears from the sky and shears through the center of the Capitol. For 2 hours, the immense storm rages through Washington, dousing most of the flames that have turned the Capitol into an inferno.
We now know a tornado actually touches down like the wrathful hand of God from the Old Testament and inflicts more casualties in the middle of that British column than they even suffered in Bladensburg.
When the storm clears out the next day, so do the British. The invasion force returns to Benedict, Maryland, a battered and bewildered unit. Meanwhile, the President and First Lady finally reunite at a roadside tavern. They return to Washington on August 27th and view the devastation. In just 24 hours, a capital that had taken 10 years to build had been reduced to a charred wasteland. The White House is now a smoldering, roofless shell. The Madisons realize that they will never live there again. Dolly's depression turns to bitterness, and the President condemns the British as damned rascals. Madison suppresses his anger by riding through the streets of the charred city. Our good president, observes banker John Barnes, is out animating the troops and encouraging the citizens not to despair.
In some ways, the war was the making of Madison as a president that connected to the people. He always was a brainiac. But with the burning of Washington, he is connecting to people in a very heartfelt way. He cares about them. He gets a sense that his constituency actually responds to him as a person, and that's the first time. He was a pretty formal guy.
Madison had just gone through a trial to rival their own. He had never been in good health, but now he had just spent 4 days on horseback with little or no sleep, rallying troops and doing what he could to defend his country. Some Washington citizens urged the president to relocate the capital to Philadelphia, but he refuses. Instead, Congress meets in a hotel while the president calls a cabinet meeting in the post office, the only government building spared. Madison confronts his Secretary of War, John Armstrong, who many blame for leaving Washington vulnerable to attack. Armstrong resigns. Madison replaces him with Secretary of State James Monroe. Yet Secretary Armstrong was prophetic on one point. he had insisted that the British would strike Baltimore. But word of Washington's devastation has already reached the city, and there the Americans would be ready and waiting. September 10th, 1814. Just 2 weeks earlier, Washington was decimated, its army virtually non-existent. The destruction of Washington has spread fear over the Chesapeake Bay, especially in Baltimore, a city the London Times calls a nest of pirates.
And it's from here that the privateers, those little sailing ships, have gone out to seize British ships so that the captains and the crew can get the prize money. And that's why this city is deliberately targeted by the British.
Baltimore had seen violent anti-war demonstrations 2 years earlier, but now the city finally galvanizes and prepares for an attack. George Douglas, a local merchant, expresses the view of many.
The horrible mismanagement at Washington has taught us a useful lesson, and we must be worse than stupid if we do not make proper use of it.
The city's leaders appoint Samuel Smith, a Revolutionary War veteran and the Major General of the Maryland Militia, to lead Baltimore's defenses.
Sam Smith's in an interesting position. His job is to grab them by the lapels and to shake them out of that sense of dread and that sense of doom and that sense of defeat, and to challenge them to believe enough in themselves and in their neighbors that this is our time. This is America's time. This is Baltimore's moment to step up. This is either our beginning or our end as a country.
Smith's appointment ignites yet another dispute. To William Winder, the hapless commander of Washington, Smith represents a more direct threat to his authority than the British. But Smith wants to avoid another disaster. And that means Winder must go.
Winder, being a regular officer, now knowing that he's being usurped by a militia officer, naturally becomes incensed. But Sam Smith is not one to be easily trifled with. And so when Winder begins to protest, to cut to the chase, Smith says, "I'm telling you how the cabbage gets chewed." And at that point, it's a done deal.
With Winder out of the way, Smith takes advantage of the British Army's slow advance to rally the entire city and bolster Baltimore's defenses. Merchant George Douglas notes the city's dramatic transformation.
At least a mile of entrenchments with suitable batteries were raised as if by magic, at which are now working all sorts of people, old and young, white and black.
They worked together, building the earthworks, protecting their livelihood. They knew at the last minute what they faced if the British took over their city.
The responsibility of galvanizing the American military presence falls to a young commander, Major George Armistead. He already knows what will be the target of a naval attack, Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor.
Major George Armistead, 38 years old, artillery officer. Armistead is ordered to Fort McHenry by the Secretary of War. Fort McHenry guards the entrance to the city of Baltimore. This is the key defense, and this is a vital role for Armistead to take command, and he loses no time in making defense preparations.
Those efforts now include turning to the people of Baltimore once again and asking them to make the supreme sacrifice for their city.
Think about the merchants of Baltimore. They were willing to sink their own ships, their livelihood, to protect the harbor of Baltimore. With these sunken hulks in the harbor, the British warships could not get any closer. They created a man-made reef that protected the rest of the city.
Armistead immediately orders 2 tiers of earthen shore batteries built and the mounting of 60 artillery pieces.
We are ready, except that we have no suitable ensign to display over the fort. And it is my desire to have a flag so large that the British will have no difficulty in seeing it from a distance.
Armistead sends an order for a large garrison flag and a smaller banner known as a storm flag to Mary Pickersgill, a maker of colors in Baltimore. The War Department pays her $574.44 for the 2 flags. The larger one, made of light wool bunting, measures 30 feet by 42 feet.
This was one very large flag. It took more than Mary Pickersgill to pull this off. There were 7 women living in that house with her, and her daughter Caroline relates this story in a letter she writes.
The flag is so very large. My mother was obliged to obtain permission from the proprietors of the Claggart's Brewery to spread in their malt house. And I remember seeing my mother down on the floor placing the stars. My mother worked many nights until 12 o'clock to complete it in the given time.
Soldiers hoist the new stars and stripes over Fort McHenry, capping the defensive preparations of Baltimore. As the largest flag in the country, it satisfies Major Armistead's order. The British will have no difficulty in seeing it. By 10 o'clock p.m. on September 10th, the city settles in, the entire area shrouded in an eerie silence. Everyone in Baltimore is aware of what is at stake. Now, the only thing they can do is wait. At noon, an alarm cannon blasts a warning to the city, shattering the quiet of a Sunday afternoon. Lookouts have sighted the British fleet off North Point. Some citizens respond in panic. Others rush to defend the city. The attack on Baltimore calls for a combined land and sea assault. By 7 a.m. the next morning, as 50 naval ships head up the Chesapeake, 4,000 British infantry troops and Royal Marines form at North Point and begin their march to Baltimore.
Marching in the hot, humid conditions of a Chesapeake Bay summer would be hard enough as it is, but marching in a woolen uniform with equipment, musket, 60 rounds of lead balls, haversack, knapsack, water canteen was absolutely draining to the soldiers. A number of them died by the side of the road.
Undaunted, British Commander Major General Robert Ross, flushed from his overwhelming victory at Bladensburg and the burning of Washington, presses on. When informed that militia make up the majority of American troops, he declares, "I don't care if it rains militia." He will soon regret those words. This time, Ross will face off against American General John Stricker, a leader with a very different attitude than his colleagues in Washington. Stricker is determined that this time the militia won't run like sheep chased by dogs as they had outside the Capitol. Outnumbered, outgunned, and knowing that they are now facing the best army in the world, Stricker instead gives his men a different order: attack.
The militia are not prone to stand a bayonet attack in the daylight, let alone in the dark, so Stricker realizes he must act. He sends an expedition forward of riflemen, cavalrymen, they detect the British and they begin to fire. The Battle of North Point is now joined.
As the fire intensifies, General Ross rides up to assess the situation. When he turns to rally the light infantry, one British lieutenant recalls what happens next.
He had scarcely entered the wood when an American rifleman singled him out. He fired the ball, true to its mark, pierced his side.
An anonymous sniper strikes down the commander of the British land forces. Ross falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Moments later, British fire fells the American rifleman. Growing weaker, Ross issues his last order. He yields command to Colonel Arthur Brooke, then dies. News of Ross's death quickly spreads through the ranks. Midshipman Robert Barrett expresses the shock shared by many in the British invasion force.
I can vouch that the lamented Major General Robert Ross was regarded by all ranks as a chivalrous hero whose humanity and bravery were equally conspicuous, and that his memory will never die in the regiments he so often led to victory.
The sniper's name has faded into history. With one shot, he would never know how he had changed the course of the War of 1812.
The tragic death of Ross affected the British Army in a very significant way. He was a known quantity. They knew what they could expect from him, and they trusted him. The British Army at this stage were in something of a quandary.
For the British, Major General Ross's death means more than just losing a leader. What was once an invincible juggernaut has experienced the first chink in its armor.
Imagine if Eisenhower had been shot the day before D-Day. That's what happened here. Ross was killed by a sniper, and the organization went into shambles.
The loss of their commander has sent shockwaves through the British Army. Ross is temporarily replaced by Colonel Arthur Brooke, an able but cautious leader. The British quickly realize that this will be a very different battle than the one just a few weeks earlier.
Brooke is in a quandary. He's against a much stronger American position than at Bladensburg. Stricker knows his business. Stricker anticipates Brooke's moves. He seems to read him like a book. As a result, every time the British columns move against the American position, Stricker dispatches troops in reserve to flesh out and harden up that defense.
To breach Stricker's defense, Brooke orders an artillery barrage. Bursts of projectiles and Congreve rockets cause confusion in the American ranks. Through clouds of musket smoke, British Lieutenant George Gleig remembers the fog of war.
Volley upon volley having been given, we were now advanced within less than 20 yards of the American line. Yet such was the denseness of the smoke that it was only when a passing breeze swept away the cloud for a moment that either force became visible to the other.
Stricker, seeing his line threatened by oncoming British forces, calls for a retreat. But unlike the militiamen who scattered at Bladensburg, he retires his troops in good order to the very outskirts of Baltimore. Meanwhile, in the harbor, Major George Armistead, the commander at Fort McHenry, views the approaching British fleet from the ramparts.
Prepare to fire! Sir, you're out of our range! Give your guns full elevation.
From the number of barges and the well-known situation of the enemy, I have no doubt but that an assault will be made this night upon the fort.
Aboard the 50-gun frigate HMS Surprise, Captain Edward Codrington reflects the confidence of the British Navy in a letter to his wife.
The work of destruction is now about to begin, and there will be many broken heads tonight. The bomb vessels, brigs, the frigates are all pushing up the river with an eagerness which must annoy the enemy, I presume as much as it delights me.
Dawn, September 13th. The bombardment of Fort McHenry commences. From their position 2 miles away, heavily armed British bomb ships unleash an early 19th century version of shock and awe.
This is the most powerful destructive force known to man in 1814. 1,500 of these are thrown at the fort, exploding 190-pound cast-iron bombs. This is what's striking fear into the hearts of the Baltimore defenders.
Miles from Fort McHenry, the citizens of Baltimore feel the power of the British artillery volleys. A local newspaper reports.
The houses in the city were shaken to their foundations. For never, perhaps from the time of invention of cannon to the present day, were number of pieces fired with so rapid succession.
8 miles away, a 35-year-old Georgetown lawyer named Francis Scott Key watches the bombardment aboard an American truce vessel. Just prior to the battle, he had arrived at the British fleet in Chesapeake Bay to secure the release of a friend. But before they can leave, the bombardment of Fort McHenry begins, and they're trapped. Key now finds himself in the middle of the storm.
Francis Scott Key is amazed and appalled by the bombardment that's going on. The absolute foundations of both Fort McHenry and Baltimore are being rocked by these 200-pound bombs that are being hurled at the fort.
As the Royal Navy bombards Fort McHenry, Colonel Arthur Brooke resumes the infantry attack on Baltimore. When he comes on the position in Hampstead Hill, he is amazed at what he sees. strongly emplaced American troops behind extensive earthworks, well armed with artillery. While the British infantry advance on Baltimore, the bombardment of Fort McHenry continues into the afternoon. Heavy rain and 13-inch mortar shells deluge the fort. At about 2 p.m., a mortar shell arcs over the walls, killing a gun commander and wounding several soldiers. Private Isaac Monroe recalls the devastation inside the stronghold.
Sergeant Clem was killed by my side, a bomb bursting over our heads. A piece the size of $1, 2 inches thick, passed through his body.
Moments later, a bomb makes a direct hit on this powder magazine, where over 250,000 pounds of powder are being stored. This is the main powder magazine for the defense of Baltimore itself. If this goes, the entire fort will go. If the fort goes, the city may very well fall.
But miraculously, the shell fails to ignite, saving Fort McHenry from utter destruction. Despite the unprecedented onslaught, American troops inside the fort counter the attack with lethal force of their own. By nightfall, the bombardment has lasted more than 12 hours. The sky over Fort McHenry is ablaze with lightning and rocket glare, as deafening thunderclaps and artillery blasts shake and rattle all of Baltimore. One U.S. Marine is awestruck by the dazzling but deadly sound and light show.
I think the handsomest sight I ever saw was during the bombardment, to see the bombs and rockets flying.
An order comes to extinguish the lights in all of Baltimore to prevent the British from seeing any strategic landmarks. Now, only the periodic flashes of lightning and exploding rockets illuminate Fort McHenry. Inside, Major Armistead and his men know they must hold out. The fate of the city, perhaps the nation itself, is in their hands. The only way Francis Scott Key and the people of Baltimore will know if they're successful is if the flag above the fort still waves. They watch, hope, and wait. Throughout the night of September 13, 1814, the British Navy keeps up its bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. One British midshipman recalls the relentless artillery attack.
All the night, the bombardment continued with unabated vigor. The hissing of rockets and the fiery shells glittered in the air, threatening destruction as they fell. Whilst to add solemnity to this scene of devastation, the rain fell in torrents. The thunder broke in mighty peals after each successive flash of lightning.
Inside the fort, with the smaller storm flag now flying above, Major George Armistead's men return fire.
The only means we had of directing our fire was by the blaze of their rockets and the flashes of their guns.
Those citizens of Baltimore who haven't already fled the city look on in awe and horror.
And Francis Scott Key is one of them. Throughout the night, he paces the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there's silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated.
While the Royal Navy shells the fort, Colonel Arthur Brooke, commander of the British Land Force, prepares a final attack on Hampstead Hill on the edge of the city. To aid Brooke, Vice Admiral Cochrane orders a diversionary attack against the western slope of Fort McHenry with a flotilla of 20 barges armed with artillery. But the Americans don't fall for the ploy. Instead, the American artillery pounds away at the diversionary force. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14th, Brooke makes a momentous decision. He orders a retreat back to the ships.
September 14th, dawn. At 4:30 in the morning, the American gun batteries here at Fort McHenry fall silent. But the bombardment continues until 7:30 that morning by the British Royal Navy. And then after 25 hours of intense bombardment, silence covers the waters of the Patapsco River and Baltimore Harbor.
That silence follows the order to stop the bombing of Fort McHenry. The nighttime flotilla operation had failed. All the while, the ragged, rain-soaked storm flag still waves defiantly over the fort's ramparts. Cochrane understands that to continue fighting is futile. One by one, each British warship that only minutes before had unleashed an unprecedented eruption of artillery and rocket fire now weighs anchor and quietly sets sail into the morning mist. An American officer recalls the sight.
The enemy has been severely drubbed, as well by his army and his navy, and now it is retiring down the river after expending many tons of shot, from 1,800 to 2,000 shells, and at least 700 or 800 rockets.
It is a moment to remember. It is a moment now that would define the importance of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, because something is about to happen.
Major Armistead quickly replaces the tattered storm flag by hoisting, as one British observer noted, a most superb and splendid ensign on the battery. The enemy has no trouble seeing it.
But gradually, the morning mists began to clear, and once more Key makes out the stars and stripes still flying above Fort McHenry. Never before has he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country.
Francis Scott Key, a reluctant patriot himself, a person who was not terribly political and somebody who was against the war itself, finds himself an eyewitness to this moment in American history.
I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and the pride of my native state. And does not such a country and such defenders of their country deserve a song?
Key takes out a letter from his pocket and jots down a few verses.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light.
The British release Key later that morning. He returns to Baltimore and continues to work on his poem.
What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming.
A few days after the bombardment, Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, is printed on handbills and distributed throughout Baltimore.
Whose broad stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming.
The poem is put to the melody of To Anacreon in Heaven, a popular British drinking song from the late 1700s.
And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there.
By November 1814, the song is published in Baltimore as the Star-Spangled Banner. Soon, other cities publish the song and it gains popularity.
Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave?
Congress officially approves the song as the national anthem in 1931.
Or the land of the free and the home of the brave.
The night of September 14th, 1814, fireworks again explode and light up the sky over Baltimore, this time in celebration.
So there were huge celebrations, fireworks and dancing, and the best letter that was written at the time came from a lady in Philadelphia who wrote to her father, and she said, "Papa, there are loud huzzahs, that's hurrahs, in the streets. General Ross is killed, Baltimore is saved." There were fears, she wrote in another letter, that the Americans might have to swear allegiance to the British crown again. That's how high the stakes were to some people.
But an entire ocean away from Baltimore, a major development takes place that will affect the course of the war. British and American representatives begin peace talks in Ghent, Belgium.
The first efforts to negotiate happened in the middle of 1813 when the Russians agreed to mediate a settlement between Britain and the United States. That didn't amount to anything. Madison had the commissioners stay in Europe and try to work on peace some other way.
Both sides want to negotiate from positions of strength. To counter the growing American momentum, British Vice Admiral Cochrane plans an assault on New Orleans, the gateway to the North American interior. A victory there would allow the British to link up with Canada and control the United States from the north, south, and west. But one man stands in their way. His name is Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson is a pugnacious individual. He's fought duels, and when he takes command of the army, lodged between his lung and his heart is a bullet. He's racked by dysentery, and yet that indomitable will pervades. And Jackson is a man to be reckoned with. Few cross Andrew Jackson, and those that do rarely walk away.
As commander of the U.S. 7th Military District, Major General Jackson must oversee the defense of New Orleans. The pending fight will be more than just a military assignment. It's a chance to exorcise a deep hatred dating back to his youth when he was taken prisoner by the Redcoats during the Revolution.
Some say it comes from the scar on his face inflicted by a British officer with his saber when Jackson refused to clean his boots, but it's deeper than that. Both his brothers and his mother have died of disease, the result of the brothers' captivity in Great Britain's hands. As Jackson's hate for the British grows, he begins looking for payback, and the War of 1812 offers the opportunity for that payback.
Jackson expressed this feeling to his wife, Rachel, at the beginning of the war.
I owe to Britain a debt of retaliatory vengeance. Should our forces meet, I trust I shall pay the debt.
But Jackson's thirst for revenge was about to clash with an unexpected adversary, the President of the United States, James Madison.
Think of these two men, Jackson and Madison. Physically, they're so different. Jackson's really tall and dynamic and vigorous military leader, and you've got Madison, who's brilliant, formally schooled, very erudite. They couldn't be more different in the way they work with other people and just the way they look.
Earlier that year, Madison had opposed Jackson's promotion to general, which was done without his consent. But despite Madison's personal dislike of the renegade, Jackson is the only man who can save New Orleans. Jackson arrives in the city on December 1st, 1814. He boldly promises to drive their enemies into the sea or perish in the effort. He acts immediately to organize the city's defenses. At once, all was bustle at New Orleans, wrote one resident. Jackson was untiringly active. Following his lead, New Orleanians of every ethnic background and social class unite to prepare for the defense of their city. Even men from as far away as Kentucky poured into the area, ready to fight. While New Orleans bustles before battle, Jackson recruits an army, illustrating the magnetic power of his charisma.
Andrew Jackson is one of the most dynamic Americans in the entire history of the country. This is a man who, by sheer force of personality, can galvanize the ordinary man in the street to take up arms and have the vigor of a professional soldier. He literally got people off the street to help defend New Orleans, and it was the sheer dynamism of his character.
If ever a diverse force had been collected to defend the United States of America, it is at New Orleans. Regulars, frontiersmen, volunteers, French-speaking Creoles, Indians, pirates, a truly diverse and almost motley accumulation of men.
You have America, so to speak, in all of its colors and languages, if you will, the common man. Would they have the discipline to stand and not retreat, not run, and obey the commands that were given?
Jackson will soon find out the answer. His ragtag army of nearly 4,000 mostly untrained men doesn't appear to stand a chance against the 10,000 British troops headed their way. By December 1814, the British invasion force has a new commander of ground forces, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham.
Sir Edward Michael Pakenham is one of the most popular officers in the British Army. He's won a great reputation wherever he served. So this is a man who the troops really look up to.
On December 12th, fishermen sight the British Armada at the entrance to Lake Bourne. When the news reaches New Orleans, citizens panic, but Jackson doesn't. Instead, he puts the city in lockdown.
Establishing some kind of order so that a resistance could be established against an invader necessitated, in his mind, the declaration of martial law. Because he really thought that the native population would cooperate with the British, would just say, take over the city, don't burn it, please. Don't do anything, that would harm us. And Andrew Jackson was determined, I think, to burn the city himself if necessary. But he wanted those people to stand with him, behind him, to repel the British invasion.
On December 14th, as the British advanced towards New Orleans, they engage a small American gunboat flotilla on Lake Bourne. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans stand and fight until nearly every man is killed, wounded, or captured. The action slows, but does not deter the juggernaut. An advanced column sludges through swamps and bayous until it reaches the Villeray plantation, about 8 miles from New Orleans. First, the British capture several members of the local militia. Then they decide to wait for the main body of the force to catch up, instead of heeding the advice of their officers to press on and take the defenseless city by surprise. It's a mistake they will soon regret.
That's the turning point, I think. The British had many more troops. They should have pressed on. They would have taken the city, I think. But they didn't. They thought that Jackson had in excess of 20,000. He had less than 3,000 or 4,000.
But the British command has no option. They are caught between the Mississippi River on one side and a swamp on the other. The only way now is to go straight ahead.
So they have to hit the American lines, hit them hard, break the line, and get through. And Jackson is determined to hold that line. And rather than wait for the British to attack, he attacks them first.
By the eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil, Jackson declares when he learns the British are only a few miles away. He immediately orders a force of some 1,500 men to ambush the British camp. The 14-gun Carolina parallels the infantry as it sails down the fog-shrouded Mississippi towards the unsuspecting enemy camp. December 23rd, 7:30 p.m. With only the light of the British campfires to guide them, the guns of the Carolina open fire. The attack, remembers one British soldier, catches the camp completely by surprise.
Flash, flash, flash came from the river. The roar of the cannon followed, pouring a perfect shower of grape and round shot into the camp.
Following the Carolina strike, the American infantry attack. The fighting in the fog and smoke becomes intense and chaotic. Soldiers clash with bayonets and fire at point-blank range. Some of the untrained militia fire back wildly and hit their own men in ferocious hand-to-hand combat. British units counterattack, forcing the Americans to withdraw. Less than 24 hours later, and 6,000 miles away, the British and the Americans come together, not on the battlefield at New Orleans, but at the peace table at Ghent.
The Treaty of Peace is signed in Belgium on Christmas Eve, 1814. But it takes 4 to 6 weeks for word to cross the Atlantic in those days, too late for armies squaring off at New Orleans.
While peace is at hand, both sides prepare for what will be the bloodiest battle of the war. Andrew Jackson organizes his force in a ditch just 5 miles from the city. Here we shall plant our stakes, he reassures his men, and not abandon them until we drive these redcoat rascals into the river or the swamp. 4,000 men, entrenched in mud, are stretched over a mile from the Mississippi River on the west to its easternmost rampart in the swampy woodlands. Meanwhile, the British advance toward the city quickly becomes a quagmire.
They push up from Lake Bourne, and they're using their small boats, the ship's boats and barges, cart the British Army up piecemeal fashion to embark operations against the Americans. There aren't enough boats. They're exhausted. It's been a long, hard campaign. Morale's dropping.
As the fog lifts on New Year's Day, 1815, the British guns open fire, taking the Americans by surprise. Solid shot, exploding mortar shells, and Congreve rockets can be heard throughout New Orleans. Old Hickory calms his anxious men.
Don't mind those rockets. They are mere toys to amuse children.
The American gunners immediately return fire, and artillery rumbles for the next 3 hours. But the hastily assembled gun emplacements cannot protect the British. One by one, their artillery pieces fall silent, some nearly out of ammunition. A British soldier expresses his dismay.
Even this artillery attack, upon which so much reliance had been placed, was found to be of no avail.
Although the artillery attack has failed, General Pakenham believes he can still smash Jackson's line if he uses his most powerful tactic, a full-out charge on the city. But Jackson will be ready for him, setting the final stage for the Battle of New Orleans. On January 7th, 1815, after weeks of holding off the British invaders, Andrew Jackson's ragtag army of 4,000 men lie in wait. At any moment, the inevitable attack will begin. The Battle of New Orleans will be the climactic showdown of the War of 1812.
As the evening of January 7th appears, the men behind line Jackson know that an attack is imminent. They can hear the sounds directly in front of them, and yet their morale is extremely high because in their mind, they have beaten the British twice. And they feel themselves almost invincible, each man relying upon that piece of wall that he himself has constructed. And it is their morale, coupled with good luck, which will turn the tide of the battle.
Just outside the city, thousands of reinforcements led by General Pakenham intend to overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers and take advantage of a glaring weakness in their defense.
Jackson's line appears weakest on its flanks. They can be easily turned, or at least so it's thought. And if those flanks can be turned, the American line will disintegrate and be rolled up and become untenable.
Pakenham devises a well-coordinated attack along the American line. Nearly 1,000 men will cross the Mississippi on the west bank, attack the American artillery batteries, and turn the guns on Jackson's own men.
With the West Bank taken, General Pakenham can begin his main attack. He has 3 columns. On his left, General Keane will create a diversion. On his right, General Gibbs will have the main column of attack and will have the job of storming over Line Jackson and taking that position. Down the center, General Lambert will bring up a column of reserve. He'll be there to throw his weight behind whatever action needs more troops.
Pakenham's plan is aggressive, but it's too complicated. He's got too many columns moving forward, and everything has got to be timed to perfection.
In the pre-dawn mist of January 8, 1815, the British begin their advance. From the start, problems plague Pakenham's troops. The muddy riverbanks slow the launching of the attack force. Once in the water, the swift current sends some boats too far downstream before they can reach the west bank. By the time they make it across the river, it will be too late to effect the battle. Elsewhere, the 44th Regiment, part of the main assault force, blunders.
The primary assault column is on the march, and the regiment that's supposed to carry the scaling ladders have forgotten them. They've left them behind. When they go back to get them, the column's already on the move.
At sunrise, the mist clears, exposing the oncoming British force, rocket fire lighting their way.
Press your lines.
Jackson calls to his men.
They are near enough now, gentlemen. You may fire when ready.
A Kentucky rifleman remembers how his fellow defenders responded to Old Hickory's orders.
Steady, boys. Hold your fire.
Take aim!
Then the heavy iron cannon.
and some thousands of small arms joined in and made the ground shake under our feet. As soon as the firing began, Captain Patterson came running along. He shouted, "Shoot low, boys! Shoot low! Break 'em!"
These Americans, instead of fleeing, stood there and decimated the British line. One cannon blast, they said, knocked out 100 British soldiers.
Second rank, advance!
And the Americans fired right into the faces of these men. It was like roaring hell, said one commentator.
The confusion in the British ranks spreads among one column led by General John Gibbs. Instead of rushing the Americans head on, they pause to return fire, including the 44th Regiment. It is a fatal mistake witnessed by a British officer.
Instantly, the whole American line, from the swamp to the point past its center, was ablaze. In less time than one could write it, the 44th Foot was literally swept from the face of the earth.
Gibbs's column continues its advance. Soldiers scramble into the ditch in front of the American line, but without extra ladders, they cannot scale the rampart and become easy targets for Americans pouring fire directly into the column. Panic breaks out and erupts into widespread chaos. Gibbs rides forward to rally his wavering men, but gets caught in the deadly fire and falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Soon after, General Keane also goes down. As the British command begins to crumble, Jackson exudes a calm confidence, observing the battle near the center of the American line. But while the center and the left hold strong, the right remains vulnerable. British troops, led by Colonel Robert Rennie, managed to storm the rampart. Bayonets clash and gunshots fire at point-blank range in hand-to-hand fighting. At this crucial point in the battle, the British have their best chance to break through the American line. But without reinforcements, Rennie is a dead man as soon as he begins his charge.
The commanders of the two primary columns have been mortally wounded or killed. Other field officers are dead. There's no one left to command. Pakenham moves forward to try and rally retreating troops. He's hit in the knee. His horse is killed. His aide gets him another horse.
But another round of grape shot rings out. He's hit. This time, it's fatal. He's hit through the arm and the spine. He's hit in the lungs, and he falls to the ground dying. The British Army has lost its commander.
In just 20 minutes, the British High Command has been obliterated. The survivors realize they will never reach New Orleans and halt the attack. Improbably, Old Hickory's ragtag army has just trounced the world's best fighting force in little more than 2 hours.
When the battle was over and Jackson came out to see, the carnage, there were some men on the bottom, on the ground, who were still alive, and their arms and legs started to come up through the bodies of the men who had fallen on top of them. And Jackson said it reminded him of the resurrection, when the dead will rise from their graves. It was quite a scene.
More than 2,000 British soldiers have been killed, wounded, reported missing, or taken prisoner. Americans report only 13 dead and several dozen wounded.
There has never been in the annals of military history such a lopsided victory as Andrew Jackson had in defeating the British.
It made no sense. Who could believe such a victory? It proved to the American people for all time that, by God, they did have the ability and the will and the leadership to defeat any country that might try to invade us. It had been in question. No more, thanks to General Andrew Jackson and the men and women who fought in the Battle of New Orleans.
On February 4th, nearly 4 weeks after the battle, news of the victory reaches Washington. The Capitol goes wild. "Glory be to God that the barbarians have been defeated," blared a local newspaper. "Glory to Jackson. Glory to the militia, sons of freedom, benefactors of your country. All hail."
There's a new sense of national pride. There's a patriotic fervor where they're voicing things of American virtue and American purity and American values as they had not done since the Revolution.
9 days later, the peace delegation returns to Washington with the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812. The terms of the treaty merely restored territorial boundaries and maritime rights to what they were before the conflict. Ironically, the treaty doesn't resolve the chief cause, impressment, which had ceased to be an issue with the end of the Napoleonic War. Congress ratifies the treaty on February 17th.
This War of 1812 started for seemingly such small reasons, will end up defining modern America. This war will confirm manifest destiny. It will lead America into the new age.
The result of the war enormously changed the capacity of the United States to exist as an independent country under a Republican Constitution. John Adams himself said that Madison's conduct of the war and the way it ended gained more glory for the country than all of his 3 predecessors put together. John Adams was not used to giving praise when it wasn't deserved.
Both James Madison and Andrew Jackson, unlikely allies, are hailed as heroes. Despite their flaws, the strengths of these 2 men would reverberate far beyond the War of 1812. Together, they would embody the personification of a new republic.
These 2 very different men are able to bring Americans together and help them get through this very difficult time, because their leadership and their beliefs represent a very broad spectrum when you put them together. That's going to be the future of America.
News of the victory spreads a euphoric nationalism throughout the country. But not everyone is celebrating. Those who oppose the war are about to pay dearly. The Federalist delegates who had pushed for secession are labeled as traitors. But for Andrew Jackson, the savior of New Orleans, his heroic exploits catapult him from the battlefield to the White House as the nation's 7th president in 1829. His election confirms the coming of age of a new America, forged by men who shaped the times through which they passed.
The War of 1812 shouldn't be forgotten, because that's a turning point in the development of American democracy, American government, the American sense of who we are. It was the one moment that we needed psychologically to prove that we had a right to exist as an independent and free nation. And we did it at that time. After the War of 1812, we proved we were here to stay. And that's why I think it should be remembered by all Americans today.
History remembers the War of 1812 as the Forgotten War. It is a story of courage, endurance, and a little bit of luck. Forged by fire, united by will, a young nation defied the odds and won.